One absolute will. Joseph Stalin vowed to build an industrial superpower, but instead, he engineered a machine of perpetual anxiety. Why did the nation freeze? It seemed like discipline, but the people were paralyzed by dread. The terror peaked during the Great Purge. At first glance, a legal process, but in reality, a theater of death. The newsreels capture the scene. His closest allies sit in the dock, sweat beads on their brows. They recite scripted lies into the microphone. Stalin turned friends into traitors, generals became spies, thousands were erased from existence. The psychological wound never healed. 1934. That was the year absolute silence settled over the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin sat at the very peak of the power structure. As general secretary, he held the keys to every door in the Kremlin. His rivals were gone. Some were in exile. Others were broken. They did not speak. They did not write. They simply waited for the end. At first glance, a nation on the rise, but in reality, a vast prison camp. Blast furnaces roared in Magnitogorsk. New metro tunnels cut through the clay beneath Moscow. Propaganda posters showed smiling workers holding heavy sheaves of wheat. The government reports claimed the system was invincible, but behind the red banners, a cold fog of anxiety descended. The fear was physical. People stopped talking in public parks. In communal apartments, neighbors pressed their ears to thin walls. One joke could lead to an arrest. One wrong word meant a 10-year sentence in the Gulag. Why did the old Bolsheviks hesitate? They remembered Lenin's final warning. They knew Stalin was dangerous. But survival instinct outweighed principles. Independent thinkers vanished from the party corridors. In their place stood distinct yes men, bureaucrats who nodded before the leader even finished his sentence. But for Stalin, this obedience was insufficient. By 1934, his paranoia consumed him. He worked at night. He paced his office. He saw daggers in every shadow and traitors in every ministry. January 1934. The 17th Party Congress opened in Moscow. The press called it the Congress of Victors. It was meant to be a coronation. The footage shows the Bolshoi Theater is packed. 2,000 delegates stand in tight rows. Medals glint under the chandeliers. They clap until their hands hurt. Speakers took the podium one by one. They competed in praise. They called Stalin the architect of socialism. They called him a genius. But the applause had a hollow ring. Eyes in the hall kept drifting to another figure. Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad. Kirov was everything the general secretary was not. He was charismatic. He laughed. He walked without heavy security. While Stalin ruled from a fortress, Kirov walked the factory floors and shook hands with mechanics. To the delegates, he looked like a savior. He was the face of a milder, brighter communism. Events accelerated. The secret ballot took place on the final day. The delegates cast their votes for the new Central Committee. The counting began behind closed doors. The results were a shock. The commission tallied the papers. Kirov received almost unanimous support, but nearly 300 delegates had crossed out Stalin's name. The officials froze. They were terrified to report the numbers. They falsified the record immediately, claiming only 3 votes went against Stalin. But the dictator found out the truth. It was a silent mutiny. His grip was slipping. December 1st, 1934. A single gunshot echoed through the corridors of the Smolny Institute. At that moment, Sergei Kirov collapsed on the floor of his office. The smell of gunpowder filled the hallway. Stalin had not forgotten the humiliation of the party congress. He had watched Kirov closely. He had waited. Now, the tragedy was absolute. The killer was apprehended instantly next to the body. His name was Leonid Nikolov. The official report claimed Nikolov acted alone. It cited personal rage and mental instability as the only motives. But the details did not add up. Nikolov was a nervous man. Police had monitored his movements for weeks, yet he walked into one of the most heavily guarded buildings in Leningrad without interference. He carried a loaded revolver past multiple checkpoints. How did a known suspect bypass elite security? It seemed impossible. But someone had opened the door. The mystery deepened immediately. Stalin did not wait for a police report. He boarded his armored train and traveled personally to Leningrad to take charge. Within hours, the arrests began. Police rounded up dozens of people connected to both Kirov and Nikolai. The accusation was swift: participation in a secret anti-Soviet plot. Strange events followed. Some of Kirov's personal bodyguards vanished. They were detained, driven away, and never seen again. Historians later uncovered a systematic purge of the archives. Files regarding the murder were burned. Documents were rewritten on direct orders from the Kremlin. At first glance, a chaotic investigation, but in reality, a calculated cover-up. Kirov's death was not just a loss, it was a weapon. It gave Stalin the perfect pretext to initiate a campaign he had planned for years. He declared a state of emergency. He claimed that enemies of the people had infiltrated every level of society. They were in the party. They were in the army command. They were on the factory floors. By 1935, the lower ranks had been purged of critics. But this was only the beginning. Stalin looked higher. He turned his gaze toward the men who had once stood beside him during the Russian Revolution. These were the old Bolsheviks. They were the architects of the Soviet state. They had fought under Vladimir Lenin in 1917. Their authority came from their history, not from Stalin's favor. The public respected them for overthrowing the Tsar. Stalin hated them for it. He feared their influence and questioned their loyalty. In his paranoia, he believed they served the memory of Lenin rather than the current leadership. Their independence made them targets. Worst of all was the connection to Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was the man Stalin despised most. He had lost the power struggle in the 1920s and was forced into exile abroad. But distance did not stop the accusations. Stalin used Trotsky's name as a brand for treason. He claimed the exile was plotting against the Soviet Union from overseas. Anyone with a past link to Trotsky was marked for destruction. The most prominent targets were Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. They had been Lenin's closest allies. They had ruled alongside Stalin in the early years. Footage from the era shows them sitting near the podium, looking anxious. They had disagreed with Stalin before. Over time, they tried to reconcile. They believed cooperation would buy them safety. There was no mistake. It was a fatal calculation. In Stalin's mind, past disloyalty was a permanent crime. 1935. That was the year the machinery of the state began to grind the old guard into dust. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, moved with sudden violence. They arrested Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and dozens of their followers. At first, the accusations were political. The detainees were charged with spreading anti-Soviet ideas. But Stalin was not interested in mere ideological differences. The charges grew darker. Investigators claimed the men had joined a secret Trotskyist Zinovievist center. The paperwork described a vast conspiracy working with foreign spies to overthrow the government. Then came the event that changed the Soviet Union forever. August 1936, the first Moscow show trial began. It was not a legal proceeding, it was a carefully staged performance. The goal was simple: convince the Soviet people that Stalin was their only shield against traitors. The Hall of Columns was grand and imposing. It was packed with journalists, party officials, and international observers. Huge black microphones stood on the tables, broadcasting every word across the 11 time zones of the country. The footage shows citizens gathered in clusters around crackling radios. In factories and communal apartments, people stopped working to listen. Zinoviev, Kamenev, and their co-defendants appeared in the dock. They looked hollow. Their faces were gray, their movements sluggish. They stood before the judges and did not argue. Instead, they confessed to wild, impossible crimes. They admitted to plotting assassinations. They admitted to sabotage. They admitted to secret meetings with Trotsky's agents in Europe. The accusations sounded unbelievable to a rational mind. Yet the Soviet press reported every word as absolute fact. Why did these hardened revolutionaries confess to lies? It seemed they had betrayed their own legacy. But the NKVD had its methods: sleep deprivation, endless interrogations, threats to murder their wives and children. The men were broken long before they entered the courtroom. The verdict came quickly. August 25, 1936, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and 14 others were found guilty. The sentence was death. There were no long appeals. Within hours, the guards opened the cell doors. The men were marched into the basement. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. They were executed by firing squad. But this was only the beginning. Stalin no longer needed proof or logic to destroy his enemies. By 1937, the Great Purge had grown into a full national campaign. It spilled out of the Kremlin. It flooded every city, every factory floor, and every remote village across the Soviet Union. To lead this massive wave of terror, Stalin chose a new instrument, Nikolai Yezhov. At first glance, a small, quiet man, barely 5 feet tall. But in reality, a monster who turned cruelty into an industry. Stalin called him the Bloody Dwarf. The nickname referred to his diminutive size and the staggering number of death warrants he signed. Under Yezhov's command, the quotas for arrests skyrocketed. Stalin personally trusted him to cleanse the Soviet Union of what he called internal enemies. The terror had found its master. 1937. In early winter, Joseph Stalin issued the command to cleanse the Soviet Union of internal enemies. The mechanism of terror began with Order number 00447. This secret decree was handed down to the NKVD. It was not just a directive, it was a hunting license. The document gave clear instructions on who to target. It listed former nobles, priests, and czarist officers. But the net was cast much wider. Ordinary workers accused of laziness or bad behavior were added to the lists. The order included specific quotas. It set precise numbers of people to be arrested and executed in every region. Why did local officials arrest more people than ordered? It seems counterintuitive, but exceeding the quota was a sign of loyalty. Regional leaders petitioned Moscow for higher limits. They asked for permission to kill more citizens to prove their devotion to the party. In that single year, the NKVD arrested more than 1.5 million people. The prison system collapsed under the weight of the intake. Cells designed for 10 people held 100. Interrogations ran on a conveyor belt system, day and night. Suspects were beaten with rubber truncheons. They were starved. They were forced to stand for days without sleep. The goal was not truth. The goal was a signature on a confession. Broken men admitted to being spies, saboteurs, or assassins. Families had no idea where their loved ones had gone. Most never returned. Between 1937 and 1938, at least 700,000 people were executed. The process was industrial. Each night, prisoners were loaded into trucks labeled bread or meat to disguise their cargo. They were driven to isolated fields or forests. The footage shows headlights cutting through the darkness of the woods. At places like Butovo near Moscow and Levashovo near Leningrad, the routine was identical. Under dim lights, the prisoners were lined up. Engines revved to mask the sound of gunshots. A bullet to the back of the head, a push into the pit. Later, excavations revealed the ground was packed with tens of thousands of bodies. But this was only the beginning. The terror bled into every layer of society. It was no longer just about government officials. Teachers, factory workers, engineers, doctors, and writers vanished. Farmers were accused of poisoning cattle. Even churchgoers were hunted down. Stalin intended to destroy religion and replace it with total loyalty to himself. Simple mistakes became capital crimes. At first glance, a functional industrial state, but in reality, a minefield where any step could be fatal. If a machine broke down at a factory, it was not an accident. It was deliberate sabotage. If a worker complained about the lack of meat in the canteen, it was anti-Soviet agitation. A careless word led directly to the basement of a focused prison. The Soviet people learned to stay silent. At work, they applauded Stalin loudly. They avoided eye contact. At home, families spoke in whispers. They feared the neighbors listening through thin walls. They feared their own children might report them at school. The government encouraged this paranoia. They promised rewards for unmasking traitors. A denunciation could win an informer the victim's apartment. Public trials turned into theater. Newspapers printed long columns of fake confessions. Radio broadcasts told heroic stories of NKVD officers uncovering vast, non-existent plots. The population read the lies and nodded. They pretended to believe, because not believing was dangerous. June 12, 1937. On this day, The Soviet military was decapitated. The Great Purge had reached its darkest stage, but Joseph Stalin remained unsatisfied. His fear now turned toward the one institution that guaranteed the nation's safety: the Red Army. At first glance, the pride of the Soviet Union. But in reality, a potential threat to the dictator's absolute power, these officers were battle-hardened veterans of the Civil War. They commanded respect. To Stalin, their independence was not a strength, it was a sign of danger. He began to suspect that his top commanders were secretly plotting his removal. Paranoia took over. Stalin became convinced that Nazi Germany had already infiltrated the military hierarchy. Why would a leader destroy his own defenses? It seemed suicidal. But Stalin did not care about logic. He cared about control. Instead of looking for real evidence, he simply invented it. The first target was Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most respected leaders in the country. He was young. He was brilliant. He pushed for modern tank warfare, while others clung to cavalry. The newsreels show him standing tall, confident, admired by the troops. But this reputation made Stalin nervous. In June 1937, the trap snapped shut. Tukhachevsky was suddenly arrested. The charge was treason. He was accused of being a German spy and organizing a coup with foreign agents. 7 high-ranking generals were dragged into custody alongside him. There was no justice here. The trial was held in total secrecy. No lawyers, no evidence, no defense. The camera of history records a dark room and exhausted men. Under brutal torture, they were forced to sign confessions they did not write. Stalin personally approved the death sentences. On June 12th, the executioners did their work. All 8 officers were shot. But this was only the beginning. The gunfire in that cellar sent shockwaves through the entire army. In the following months, the purge spread like a virus to every level of command. Officers were arrested on fabricated charges of espionage or sabotage. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 35,000 officers were purged. The impact was immediate and disastrous. The Red Army lost its brain. Experienced strategists vanished. Military academies shut down or filled their halls with unqualified replacements. Trust evaporated. Soldiers looked at their commanders with suspicion. Commanders were too afraid to make independent decisions. Fear paralyzed the ranks. 44,000 signatures. That is the number of death warrants Stalin personally approved. By the late 1930s, the dictator's paranoia had detached from reality. He did not simply issue general orders, he demanded the lists. He sat at his desk, scanned the columns of typed names, and marked them with a red pencil. A simple "approve" meant immediate execution. Archives later exposed the mechanical nature of this slaughter. It was paperwork. But for the victims, it was the end. Even the inner circle was not safe. Why did he target his most loyal allies? Logic suggests he needed their support. But for Stalin, total dependence required total terror. Alexander Poskrebyshev was Stalin's shadow. He served as the personal secretary guarding the door to power. Yet, the system came for his wife. She was accused of anti-Soviet behavior. Stalin signed the paper. He did not pick up the phone. He did not offer a pardon. Poskrebyshev continued to work, organizing files for the man who murdered his family. It went deeper. Stanislav Radins was the dictator's brother-in-law. He was a former NKVD chief who knew where the bodies were buried. Agents kicked down his door anyway. He was arrested, interrogated, and shot. But execution was often a mercy. Those who escaped the bullet faced a slower erasure. The state fed them into the Gulag. At first glance, a prison map. But in reality, a slave empire. A vast network of camps metastasized across the Soviet Union. It stretched thousands of miles, from the timberlands of Siberia to the scorching sands of Kazakhstan. By the end of the 1930s, 400 separate camps operated at full capacity. The scale was industrial. Between 1937 and 1939, trains carried 2 million people into the void. Most prisoners had committed no crime. They were not spies. They were not saboteurs. They were victims of quotas. Being 20 minutes late to a factory shift, losing a wrench, telling a joke about the government in a communal kitchen. Fear turned citizens into predators. Neighbors reported neighbors to steal a larger room. Co-workers denounced rivals to secure a promotion. The black cars arrived at night. The knocking on the door signaled the end of a life. Inside the perimeter, humanity vanished. Inmates worked shifts of 12 to 16 hours. The temperature plunged below -40 degrees Celsius. They built railroads on permafrost. They dug coal with primitive picks in bare hands. The footage shows gaunt figures in rags chipping at the ice. Survival was a statistical improbability. Clothing was paper thin. Rations consisted of watery soup and stale bread. Medical care did not exist. At night, prisoners packed into wooden barracks, hundreds of bodies pressed together, fighting for warmth in unheated sheds. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Tuberculosis coughed through the bunks. Scurvy rotted teeth. Starvation was the baseline state of existence. The guards operated without restraint. A prisoner slows down, a rifle butt to the spine. A prisoner falls, they are left in the snow to freeze. Certain names became synonymous with death. Kolyma, the Far East. The ground was solid ice. Men mined gold there, burning out their bodies in months. Vorkuta, deep in the Arctic Circle. Inmates toiled in the endless darkness of the polar winter. The numbers confirmed the horror. In Kolyma, nearly 30% of the workforce died every single year. This was not a correctional system. It was a machine designed to break the human spirit, physically, mentally, spiritually. Stalin did not just want labor, he wanted silence. Fear was the only currency left. 1938. This was the year the Great Purge reached its absolute peak. The regime prepared for a grand finale. It was called the Trial of the 21. Stalin designed this event as the final public demonstration of his total dominance. The accused were not low-level functionaries or anonymous bureaucrats. They were the last giants of the Communist Party. Nikolai Bukharin sat in the dock. He was once Lenin's closest ally, a man previously known as the Darling of the Revolution. Beside him sat Alexei Rykov, a former Soviet premier who once governed the entire nation, and near them, a man who knew the system best, Genrikh Yagoda, the very architect of the NKVD. The man who built the camps was now a prisoner within them. March 1938. The trial began. The courtroom was transformed into a theater set. Cameras captured every gesture. Prosecutors read endless lists of fabricated crimes, espionage, sabotage, treason. The footage shows the defendants are gaunt, pale, and broken. Bright studio lights bear down on them, exposing every twitch of exhaustion. Why did they confess to crimes they did not commit? It seemed irrational, but months of sleep deprivation and interrogation had destroyed their wills. They recited their lines perfectly. They admitted to plotting against the state. The spectators in the hall listened in silence. No one dared to cough. Everyone understood the script, but fear sealed their lips. It was a signal to the entire nation. Even the founding fathers of the Soviet Union could be erased. At first glance, a legal proceeding, but in reality, a scripted performance. Nikolai Bukharin tried to maintain his dignity. He faced the verdict without tears. But there was no mercy. March 15, 1938. The firing squad did its work. A single bullet ended the life of Lenin's favorite theorist. Rykov and Yagoda followed him into the pit immediately after. The public show ended here, but the machinery of death did not stop. It only went underground. The cameras turned off. The executioners worked overtime. Black vans moved through the cities at night. In the forests outside Moscow and Leningrad, truck engines roared to mask the sound of gunshots. The NKVD prisons were bursting at the seams. Convoys drove into the deep woods. Soldiers dug trenches in the frozen fields. Thousands of bodies were thrown into the earth, layer upon layer. No names were recorded. No markers were placed. The state buried its own history in secret. By the end of 1938, Stalin stood alone at the summit. Every rival was dead or buried in the permafrost. He had achieved total control. But the price was catastrophic. Chaos paralyzed the state. Factories missed quotas because the managers were dead. The Red Army lost its best commanders. Citizens lived with packed suitcases by the door, waiting for the knock. Even foreign allies began to recoil, asking what was happening inside the Soviet borders. The country was purified. but it was also bleeding. Thus ended the Great Terror. November 1938. Even foreign allies began to ask uncomfortable questions about the blood flowing in the streets of Moscow. To protect his image, Stalin needed a scapegoat for the excess violence. He needed someone to blame for the chaos he personally orchestrated. His gaze fell on Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD. Why did Stalin destroy his most loyal executioner? Yezhov had fulfilled every dark order without hesitation. But in the dictator's world, a witness to crimes is as dangerous as an enemy. Yezhov was once the most feared man in the Soviet Union. Citizens whispered his name in terror. Suddenly, the script flipped. The state apparatus accused him of abusing power and distorting socialist justice. Stalin publicly claimed that Yezhov had gone too far, that he had executed innocent people and created unauthorized disorder. It was a lie, but it was effective. In November 1938, the shift began. Yezhov was quietly removed from his post. He was replaced by Lavrenti Beria. Beria was a calculating official from Georgia, ruthless and patient. He had been waiting years for this opening. He immediately began reviewing Yezhov's files, pretending to restore legality. At first glance, a return to order, but in reality, a mere changing of the guard at the slaughterhouse. Beria continued the brutal practices, just with more discretion. By April 1939, the trap snapped shut. Yezhov was arrested. The interrogators did not hold back. For months, they tortured the former police chief. They broke him physically and mentally. He signed confessions admitting to impossible crimes. He claimed to be a traitor, a foreign spy, and a secret enemy of Stalin. February 1940. A prison basement. A single shot ended Yezhov's life, but death was not enough. The regime wanted him forgotten. Technicians in the archives set to work. They took official photographs of Stalin walking near canals or sitting in offices. They airbrushed Yezhov out of the frames. Where a man once stood, now there was only water or a stone wall. He was erased from documents and history books. There was no turning back. By this time, the Great Purge was finally winding down. The daily rhythm of mass arrests slowed, but the damage was already absolute. Historians estimate that 1.2 million people were killed. Some researchers believe the true number is much higher. The visual evidence of this toll was everywhere. Whole villages stood quiet, stripped of their men. Women worked the fields alone. The footage shows orphanages overflowing with children. These were the sons and daughters of enemies of the people. They grew up in state barracks, often told their parents were criminals. The Soviet Union's institutions were hollowed out. The Red Army had lost the majority of its experienced officers, a fact that would prove disastrous within 2 years. The government was staffed by men too terrified to make a decision. They looked over their shoulders before signing a single paper. Factories lost their engineers, universities lost their professors, research centers stood empty. The brightest minds were either dead or digging frozen earth in the Gulag. Creative voices fell silent. A cultural vacuum formed that would persist for decades. But for Stalin, this was a masterpiece. In his eyes, the operation was a total success. The purges had cleansed the party of potential traitors. There were no rivals left. No one dared to challenge his rule. Every person remaining in power owed their survival solely to him. That fear guaranteed absolute loyalty. The country was left with deep scars. Silence became a survival strategy. This fear passed down through generations. It wasn't until after Stalin's death in 1953 that the ice began to crack. 3 years later, Nikita Khrushchev took the podium. In his secret speech of 1956, he did the unthinkable. He exposed Stalin's crimes to the party elite. The audio recording captures a heavy, stunned silence in the hall, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Khrushchev admitted that thousands had been killed without reason. For decades, these party members had believed the purges were necessary for survival. Now they confronted the horror behind the lies. A process of rehabilitation began. Some prisoners were released. The government officially admitted that a few victims were innocent. But for the vast majority, justice never came. Their names remained in closed archives. The dead did not return. the damage was irreversible.